Hi, I'm Nicole Easterday, the founder of FARMcurious and the creator of the FARMcurious Fermenting Set. I'm back to teach you the basics of fermentation and to talk to you about some tips and tricks on using the FARMcurious Fermenting Set. Fermentation is the action of microorganisms on plant or animal matter. Lactofermentation is the action of microorganisms that ends in a strain in the Lactobacillus family. Lactobacillus thrives in a salty environment that would otherwise be inhospitable to other bacteria. It also lowers the pH to deter competing bacteria, which would otherwise decompose the food before you were ready. Fermentation actually predates written history and was likely enjoyed by animals long before humans even came along. Pliny the Elder described fermentation as spontaneous generation, but scientists now know that those microorganisms that cause fermentation are likely all around us all the time, just waiting for the right environment to do their work. Another important thing to note about fermentation is that the human experience of fermented flavors is entirely cultural. While anthropologists have yet to find a group of humans that didn't employ fermentation in one way or another, the variation among cultures varies widely. For example, Germans tend to enjoy the tangy, slightly pungent flavors of sauerkraut, while the Japanese are more likely to enjoy fermented soybeans called natto, which can be a little slimy. The French really like their fermentations in cheese. The funkier and the more pungent, the better. While the scent of those same delicious cheeses that the French enjoy may totally gag the Chinese, who are much more likely to indulge in stinky tofu, whose name says it all. Why has every group of humans everywhere enjoyed fermentation? Evolution actually has the answer for us. Before cooking arrived on the scene, early primates actually spent 90% of their calories hunting and chewing food. Because the microorganisms involved in fermentation can help pre-digest food for you, it opened up a lot of calories that those primates could spend doing other more enjoyable things. The other cool thing about fermentation is that it provides additional vitamins that were not available in the plain raw food, so it was much better for their nutrition. That brings us to one of the largest benefits of eating fermented food. The microorganisms that are available in, say, a batch of sauerkraut will actually colonize your digestive system and continue doing the work of helping you break down your food and providing additional nutrition to you. This colonization obviously helps with digestion, but it has a lot of other benefits as well. Vitamins that didn't formerly exist in the raw food are produced during the fermentation process. Vitamin K, as well as a suite of B vitamins, are produced, allowing additional nutrition to come from the food. The suite of vitamin B is actually a very helpful benefit to vegans and vegetarians because it's a non-animal source of these essential B vitamins. Because certain bacteria have actually evolved to coexist with humans and benefit us, our bodies can actually be viewed as a microcosm rather than an individual body. The majority of the DNA in our bodies is actually non-human DNA. It's the DNA of these little bacteria that live with us. In fact, over 90% of the cells in our body are not even human cells. This is what we call the human microbiome. Fermenting food at home is one of the best ways to ensure a healthy collection of good gut bacteria. Not only does it provide additional bacteria for your gut to help colonize in the right places, it also provides food for that bacteria. We call this prebiotics. That's the food for the healthy gut beasties to eat. People have been fermenting food since prehistoric times, and it doesn't require a degree in microbiology or even a completely sterile environment to do it. All you need is vegetables, salt, a container, and a knife. Traditionally, people fermented using a crock. It might have been a small one like this, or even a gigantic one that people would keep in their root cellar. So to make a traditional sauerkraut, you would cut up your vegetables, put them in a bowl, and layer them with salt as you go. As you layer, you want to crunch up the vegetables with the salt so the salt can break the cells and pull moisture out of the vegetables. The key to an open system like a crock is to keep all the vegetables below the brine level. Anything that pops up above the brine has access to oxygen and can start to grow yeast or mold. Growing mold on the top isn't the end of the world. Most fermenters who have been fermenting for a while just scrape the mold off the top and move on with their lives. They may have to do that every couple of days, but you can understand why it might be a deal breaker for modern fermenters, especially people who are new to the process. There are several inherent problems with the classic crock form of fermentation. First of all, the idea of pulling mold off the top of something that you plan on eating is pretty unappetizing to a lot of people. It turns out that the same people who are okay with cutting a small bit of mold off a chunk of cheese are totally put off by pulling mold off the top of a fermentation. Second, the schedules of the modern family don't frequently allow for the constant vigilance required by an open fermentation set. That business trip you had planned might be out of the question when you're supposed to check your sauerkraut for mold every 2 days. Third, while there are smaller, more attractive fermenting crocks that you can use on your countertop, even this one is much too big for a batch of something you're not sure you're going to like say fermented onions, where you might only want about 8 ounces. I also like to encourage people to try as much variety of fermented foods as possible. While you may have room for a couple of jars in your cabinet, you probably don't have room for more than one of these beautiful crocks. It's nice to try a variety, and there is an option for people who want to try a lot of different fermented items. Finally, there's the issue of something we haven't quite discussed yet. While the end result of a fermentation shouldn't be terribly smelly, there are some bacterial phases along the way that can get pretty stinky and even put off the most adventurous eater. Enter the FARMcurious Fermenting Set. This set has been developed to solve all of those problems that we already talked about. The airlock system here actually creates a barrier between the scent inside the fermenting system and the ambient air that you're breathing every single day, cutting down on the possibility that something will smell bad. There are 2 different procedures depending upon whether you're using leafy vegetables like cabbage or thicker, firmer vegetables like carrots. We're talking about using firmer vegetables first, as that's the most straightforward method. If using firmer vegetables, you simply chop the produce any way you like. It's a good idea to use uniform sizes because any smaller sizes will ferment more rapidly than larger sizes will. Drop the produce into any wide-mouth mason jar, leaving about 1 inch at the top. Mason and ball jars actually have a line here called the freeze line, and that can be your guide. Put lighter things like herbs at the bottom and heavier items up at the top. I also like to layer them in a pattern so they look nice, which is especially good for gifts. Next, we make a brine. The simplest way is to mix together 1 cup of water with 1 tablespoon of kosher salt. The reason we say kosher salt is because salt is actually best measured by weight than by volume. That's why when you see a lot of recipes talking about 2% or 5% brine solution, it's a measurement by weight. This is because a tablespoon of really finely ground sea salt will be much more salt than a tablespoon of coarser salt or flaked salt. Since many beginners don't have a gram scale in their kitchen, we've made it easy for you. Kosher salt, unlike most salts, is uniform in size, and we feel safe saying that 1 tablespoon of kosher salt will work well with 1 cup of water. Speaking of water, many fermenters feel strongly that you shouldn't use tap water because of the chlorine and fluoride. I've never had issues with my Bay Area water in California, but if you have strange outcomes, you might consider using bottled water. Once you have your brine solution, you're going to pour it over the top of the vegetables. You want to make sure, once again, that you leave 1 inch at the top, using the freeze line as your guide. This space is important because as carbon dioxide is produced during fermentation, it'll come up and push the oxygen out. It's okay if you have some pieces sticking up above the brine level, as the carbon dioxide barrier will keep those pieces safe from yeast and mold. Now all you have to do is apply the FARMcurious Fermenting Set. You take the lid off of the airlock and pour the water in halfway up. You put the lid back on, stick the airlock into the stopper, and put the stopper in the recap top. Now, you just screw the top on the top of the mason jar. All your work is now done, and it's time to let the bacteria do their part. Leave the jar on your counter or in a dark cabinet for 3 to 6 weeks undisturbed. The airlock should keep the fermenty scent at bay. If you're watching it, you'll see the bottom of the jar start to get a little cloudy. That's the bacteria starting to accumulate, and it's a good sign. You may see bubbles start to appear, but don't worry if you don't see any. What's happening is that the bacteria is starting to munch on the sugars in your vegetables. They produce lactic acid and carbon dioxide as byproducts. The falling pH is creating an environment that is inhospitable for competing bacteria. As the carbon dioxide rises through the vegetables to the top of the jar, it pushes out the remaining oxygen. The oxygen and excess carbon dioxide escape through the water in the airlock, but yeast and mold can't get back down into your jar. This keeps the system clean and safe. Now the fun part. A lot of people ask me when they'll know that their ferment is done, and it's truthfully hard to say. Some people like the mild flavor of a fermentation that's only a week or two old, while other people like a much more tangy acidic flavor that's developed over 6 weeks or so. It also depends on the temperature of the room. If your room is warmer, the fermentation will go much faster. If the room is colder, the fermentation happens much more slowly, which is why a lot of people ferment in a root cellar. Here's a little trick though. If you end up with something that's much more mild than you would normally eat, you can pair it with a cheese plate where the mild flavor will fit in quite nicely with the cheese and a little bit of meat. If you end up with something that's much more tangy than you would eat alone, you can mix it in with a pasta salad or a potato salad in the place of pickles, and it'll really tone down that flavor. I really hope that this video helps you in your fermenting adventures. Thanks so much for all the people who helped make the FARMcurious Fermenting Set a reality. And be sure to check out our support page at www.farmcurious.com/ferment. Happy fermenting, everybody!